Welcome to this video where I'm going to take you guys through a backyard playset build. And the first question I'm probably going to get is, why would you build one when you can buy one? Well, we're currently in the 2020 COVID pandemic, and if you check on all of the websites that sell these kinds of things, you won't find them in stock anywhere. So I designed my own, and you can see here that there is a drawing that I made available to you guys. And the first thing that we're going to tackle in this drawing and the construction is building the A-frames that make up this playset. So let's get started with those. Each of the three A-frames consist of two large legs that are cut from 10-foot long 2x6s. And so I got the 2x6 laid out on my miter station, and I'm going to be cutting those at an angle of 22.5 degrees, and the two ends are going to be cut parallel to one another. So I'm going to cut that first side at 22.5 degrees. I'm going to measure my length as according to the drawing and cut the other end parallel to that at 22.5 degrees. Then I'm going to repeat this 6 times because we're going to need 6 legs to make up 3 frames. Next, I'm going to start measuring out and cutting the 3 different length horizontal braces that attach to the legs of the A-frame. Now, these are also cut at the 22.5 degree angle, except the two ends on the same piece are actually cut at opposing angles to one another, so they're not parallel like the ends that we just cut on the legs, and you'll see that in the drawing. You'll also see that all of the horizontal braces are made from 2x4s, whereas I mentioned earlier, the legs are made from 2x6s. Now, before assembling the A-frames, there's one more cut we need to make here on each end of each of the legs. And so I'm going to take my speed square, going to line up the pivot point with the corner on the short end of the leg, mark a line 3 inches in from there, and the speed square is going to give me a perpendicular line to that cut face. And so we're going to chop this piece off. And so I'm going to repeat this on only one end of each of the legs. At this point, you're going to want to find yourself a flat surface to work on, like your garage floor, and start laying out the members of the A-frame. Take a very close look at the drawing. As you'll see, not all 3 A-frames are completely identical. Some of those cross members fall on different sides of the legs. Up at the top of the A-frame, you'll notice that those cuts that we made to those 2x6 legs are located here, and those are to accommodate the cross section of the 4x4 post that we will install later. And so what I've actually done is just taken a 2x4 and cut it down to size to simulate the cross section of that 4x4 post. And that's going to make sure when I slide it in there that everything fits later on before fastening down that first cross member. So I'm going to start screwing in this top horizontal cross member. And for those of you guys paying real close attention, you'll see that I'm using these number 8 deck screws. Now, despite these screws being rated for outdoor use and for use within pressure treated wood, this is not the recommended application for them, and later in the video I'm going to have to come back and replace them with what's known as structural screws. And the reason for this is that deck screws are often of unknown quality. And so even though a number 8 screw of good quality may be more than up to the task for this sort of application, a deck screw is, like I said, of unknown quality. It may be too brittle for the application. It may fail unexpectedly. And so I'm going to come back later with some Timberlock structural screws, and as the name would suggest, they're rated for structural use. And I'm going to replace them in all of the structural connections on this playset. Keep in mind, you also have a few other options here to make these connections, like leg screws or even leg bolts. But the Timberlock screws that I've selected are rated to replace 3/8 inch leg screws. And the big advantage here is that you don't have to do any sort of pre-drilling. Additionally, with a little bit more research, I also found out that using a smaller diameter screw actually increases the shear pull-through strength of the wooden material. And so the wooden members will actually be able to carry more load in shear without having that risk of tear through, instead of using a larger diameter leg screw or leg bolt. So it's actually the best of both worlds. Now I can work my way through the rest of the A-frame, positioning and attaching the horizontal members according to the drawing. I'm going to be paying careful attention to which side of the A-frame that I'm attaching these members. As I mentioned earlier, not all of them are completely identical. And here's a quick shot of one of the A-frames completed. The 2x4 at the bottom of the legs is just there for support. It's not fastened down. So now we're ready to come back up to the top of the A-frames, and we're going to be using our pocket drilling jig here to drill some pocket holes across the tops of the legs, and these pocket holes are going to be used to eventually fasten these legs to the 4x4 beam that runs right through the middle of these A-frames at the top. And once we're done with the 4 pocket holes per A-frame, we can move on to making the gussets that will attach to the legs and to the 4x4 beam to give these corner connections some extra strength. And so there are 4 corner gussets, each of them made from 2x4 material, and we can make the main cuts with the miter saw, and then we can take our speed square and measure about 2 1/4 inches off of the heel of one of those cuts and draw a perpendicular line to that face, and that line we are going to cut so that we can mate these corner gussets to the horizontal cross members on the A-frame. And so off of that face, we are going to use our pocket drilling jig, and we're going to drill our 2 pocket holes that are eventually going to make that connection that I just mentioned from the gusset to the second horizontal cross member on our A-frame. If you're using pocket holes like me, it doesn't necessarily matter which side of these parts you drill them on, but if you are a little bit OCD and you want the finished product to look even on both sides, then you will want to make 2 parts mirror images of the other. At this point, before going any further in the assembly, if there are any faces of your wood that are left untreated because they are fresh cuts like these, you might want to consider coming in with some cut and seal in order to finish those end grains off and seal them up, because later on in the assembly they may be impossible to reach, or at least very difficult. And the biggest ones that I can think of right now will be the bottom of the A-frames. So those feet that you cut at that 22.5 degree angle, those, once we put those on the ground, you won't be able to reach them. And considering that they're on the ground, you're really going to want to seal those up nice with a few coats of this cut and seal. And now I've got my A-frames out in my yard where I'm going to be doing my final assembly, and I've temporarily screwed in another 2x4 here just to hold them up on their sides so they don't tip over. And I'm going to spend some time just positioning these A-frames according to the drawing. And I got my 4x4 beam up at the top, laid out on the ground. And the reason for putting these things on their side is so that later on, when it comes time to actually insert that 4x4 beam into the slot in the top of the A-frames, I don't have to lift it 10 feet overhead. I just have to lift it a few inches off the ground and hold it in place while we screw things down. Now you can see I'm inserting that 4x4 beam into the 2 right-hand side A-frames that make up the climbing wall and slide portion of this playset. On the far left-hand side, where there's currently no A-frame standing upright, the beam is just supported by some wood so that it's not hanging freely in the air and pulling on things. So I'm going to temporarily clamp this beam into place before screwing it down. And before even drilling the legs directly into the 4x4 beam, I've got my 5/4 inch cedar deck boards here, and I've created a drilling template. I'm going to be using those to square up these 2 frames with one another, like I said before, even attaching them to that 4x4 post. I'm going to start by paneling up what will become the landing on the playset, and then I'm going to work my way down the legs and panel up what will become the climbing wall. And so the landing panels are attached to the horizontal cross members on the A-frames, and then the climbing wall panels are attached directly to the legs themselves. During this process, I'm going to continually check that my 2 frames remain square to one another with a large drywall T-square. Don't forget to leave some small gaps between your boards on the landing to allow for the wood to expand and contract and to allow for water drainage. On the climbing wall, I'm leaving 1.5 inch spacing between the panels, and I'm just using a regular 2x4 here to maintain consistent spacing. With the 2 A-frames good and square, I can now get the 2 pocket screws screwed in on the accessible side of the legs. On the other side, I currently can't get those pocket screws screwed in, so I'm going to leave the clamps in place during the rest of this assembly. Now I can move over to the far left-hand side and get this A-frame squared up and in place. Again, I'm using a temporary 2x4 here to help me out in the process. It's just got 1 screw in it so it can easily pivot about and allow me to line up this A-frame. Once I was satisfied with the position of the far left A-frame, I used these 8-foot-long 2x4s to temporarily secure the legs into position with the middle A-frame. This is going to provide a little additional rigidity to the whole frame when we ride it, as well as when we move it around within the yard. Now we can start positioning and fastening the gussets to the frame, and you'll notice here that I'm using some pocket screws. So the pocket holes that we drilled earlier, I'm going to be using outdoor rated pocket screws on those holes up at the top into the 4x4 beam. In this video here, you'll see me using those deck screws, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is not the correct application. I'll be coming back later to replace those with those Timberlock screws that I showed you earlier in the video, which are structurally rated screws. Behind the gusset, you may also notice another 8-foot-long 2x4 that I have temporarily fastened to the A-frame. This is again going from the middle A-frame to the far left A-frame to add even more rigidity to the whole structure while we go through this process of assembly and moving it into the final position in the yard. I've come to the point now where I felt confident that the structure is strong enough that it can withstand being righted. So I don't have anyone to help me through this process, so I took the risk of doing this myself, and with a big lift I was able to get the whole frame up into the air and then try my best to slowly bring it down. In hindsight, it would have been nice to have an extra hand in this process, but the frame did survive the righting process. With the frame upright, I'm going to hop up onto the platform to test its durability, and then I'm going to be able to access those pocket screws up on the top of the A-frame that I did not have access to while those A-frames were laying on their side on the ground. On the far left-hand side, I'm going to use a step ladder to get up and remove that 8-foot long 2x4 that I temporarily screwed into place, and then I'll be able to fasten the other gusset as well as finish off the pocket screws on this A-frame as well. I'm going to repeat this process on the middle A-frame here with these gussets, and you can see here that I'm using an offcut of a 2x4 clamped into place to make sure my gussets are evenly spaced across that cross member. And then another quick loading test gives me the confidence to keep moving on with this build. Next on the to-do list is to hang the actual swings, and I'm using this generic swing hardware here that already comes with these swing bushings in place, and they also come with reinforcement plates that you screw in, and it prevents the eyelets from backing out. And so I started measuring out the locations for the swing hardware, and in my case I'm using an infant swing and one adult swing. Each of these came with instructions, and on the infant swing it said 18 inches between those eyelets. On the adult swing I settled on 21 inches, and I found that to be sufficient. Later on when I tested this thing out, keep in mind that you're going to want to provide sufficient spacing between each of the adjacent swings, as you don't want people coming into contact with one another while they're swinging if they start twisting and turning. So use your good judgment, and I think I left about 20 inches between those swings, and that was more than enough. With locations marked, I drilled the pilot holes for the eyelets, and then I was able to screw those in by hand. So when screwing in the eyelets, just a quick tip, use a screwdriver, insert it through the eyelet, and this gives you a lot of leverage on that eyelet when you're screwing it in. Otherwise, it's going to be near impossible to do it with your bare hands. Also, don't forget to put the reinforcement plates over the eyelets before you screw them into your beam. Otherwise, you're going to have to unscrew them and then screw them back in. Ask me how I know. Then it's time to actually hang the swings on the S-hooks, and if you find that the chain or rope that came with your swing is not long enough for your application, head to your local hardware store and find some chain that has the appropriate load rating for your application, and you can get them to cut it, and you can essentially make some extensions for your swing to get it to hang lower. And hopefully the chain at your local hardware store also has a coating that will help it last a little longer outside without rusting too quickly. Finally, don't forget to crimp closed your S-hooks so that your chain cannot come out. You definitely don't want this to accidentally happen. I was able to crimp these closed with some large channel locks. After that, things are looking pretty good, and you can give the swings a test. I figured now is also a good time to level out the playset, and you have a few options to do this. If you have a spot picked out in your yard where you think your playset is going to sit for a long time and you're not going to move it around, one of your options to level out your playset is actually to cut some of the legs in order to achieve that level. Now, of course, cutting those legs is not reversible, so if you think that the position of your playset might change in the future, you probably don't want to do that. I didn't want to go the leg cutting route, so I started designing these leveling feet. I started off by working with some 2x6 material and cutting some 45-degree teeth into the bottom of the 2x6, and these teeth are going to allow the feet to sink into the lawn and provide some grip so that the feet don't move. Each foot consists of 2 of these 2x6 pieces of material here that I've cut the teeth into, and I'm going to sandwich in a piece of 2x2 material in between these 2x6 pieces, and I'm going to set the height of that 2x2 material to the desired height of which I want to raise the legs to level out my playset. Keeping in mind that these feet are going to be in contact with the ground, I liberally applied that cut and seal sealant all over these feet in order to ensure that they should last a long time. And so this is what those feet will look like that will go under the far left-hand side A-frame of my playset to get this thing leveled out. Installing the feet was as simple as slipping the A-frame legs into the slot and then securing them down with some screws. And with the feet secured to the frame, I can now pound the feet into the ground with a mallet and setting them into the grass and the soil so that they will not move around. As a consequence of lifting the legs of the far left-hand side of the playset higher up off the ground to level the whole thing out, I noticed that the legs in the center A-frame were no longer in contact with the ground. So I had to come up with some lower profile feet here, and again I went back to the 2x6 material and actually cut a groove into it because I only needed a 1-inch space off the ground, so I didn't have room for those teeth and those 2x2 pieces. So what I did here, like I said, was I cut a groove into the 2x6 that the middle legs will slide into, and I'll just fasten those down so it's more like a little bit of a spacer than those feet with the teeth in it. And since we're on the topic of the playset feet, one absolutely critical detail that you need to take care of when building a playset is anchoring the playset. Now in my particular case, I'm going to go with some screw type ground anchors. These screw type ground anchors I find are the best for this kind of soft soil or grass, but I cannot stress enough how important it is to anchor the playset with something. Whatever you do, please do not leave it unanchored, as it could easily crush a child if it were to tip over, and it's worth the few extra dollars for that added insurance. And so that concludes the build of the playset frame in its most basic form. I'm going to continue on with the rest of this video, and I'm going to be adding a few additional features here that give the frame a lot of added strength and rigidity. And so I'm going to start by installing a center joist down the middle of the platform, and it needs 2 lateral members that I'm going to be using these pocket screws here to add to the frame in order to support that center joist. And so I'm going to start by screwing in those supporting 2x4s using pocket screws into the horizontal cross members of the A-frame. Then I can line up my single 2x4 joist, and I can use the pocket screws again to secure it into those supporting members. And with the center joist in place underneath, I can come back up to the top side using my drilling jig, and I can start pre-drilling my holes for my number 8 deck screws. So I'm going to pre-drill them first, and then I'm going to come in and countersink those holes as well to make sure none of the boards split. These boards are made of cedar material, and these are 5/4 boards. And for a little bit of additional safety, I cut up a few more 2x4s to add as railings to either side of the platform, just to make sure that nobody falls through the hole between those horizontal braces. And there's actually still a pretty sizable hole there, so if you have really young children, you may want to add something like pickets or even some horizontal fence boards to completely block off those holes. Now overall, the basic frame was pretty stiff, and it was more than sufficient to hold small children. But I really wanted to go the extra mile here and stiffen up these corner braces with some extra material. So what I did was I took some extra 2x4 material and I doubled it up, and I placed it in between the original corner gussets, and I created sort of a truss type system here to really stiffen up the corners. The stiffness of these corner gussets is absolutely essential to providing lateral stiffness to this entire A-frame system. At this point, you may also notice the black screw heads of those Timberlock structural screws that I mentioned earlier in the video. So I've gone around the whole playset and I've added those everywhere. This is an absolute must, as you should not be relying on the deck screws to hold everything together. Moving on to some of the playset accessories, one of the things I was able to find that was in stock were these plastic climbing rocks. Now these guys install with 2 bolts each, and you can just simply pre-drill through your cedar or pressure treated boards and then use the included hardware to install them. And so on the back side they have T-nuts that you can just hammer into place, and on the front side, like I said, there's some hex bolts, and those just fasten in with some washers to prevent crushing the plastic. The climbing rocks that I found come in packs of 4, and you're going to need at least 2 sets in order to make a reasonable climbing course in order to get up to that platform. Now every playset needs a slide, and I picked up this weathered slide for free from a coworker. Now whether or not slides are back in stock at the time of your build, it's really worth checking in with family members, friends, or coworkers to see if they have an old playset that they're ready to get rid of. They may have kids that are at an older stage in life that are no longer using their playset, and these slides are big, bulky, and hard to throw in the garbage, and I'm sure they would be happy to have you come and offer to haul it away for free. So don't be shy to ask around, as it'll save you some money, and you'll save it from the landfill for at least a few more years. And if it is looking weathered like mine is here, just give it a good clean, degrease it, and then grab some spray paint, and in no time you'll have yourself a brand new looking slide. Attaching the slide is pretty straightforward. I'm using 2 of these structural screws that go through the slide, through the deck board, and into the horizontal 2x4 that you can see in this video clip. And if you find that the bottom of the slide is moving around too much, you can grab some 2x2 wooden stakes, drive them into the ground behind the slide so that they're hidden out of view, and then you can just simply screw the slide into those wooden stakes to anchor the bottom of the slide. If you really want to go the extra mile on this playset, you can build the optional roof. The drawing for the roof can be found on the second page of the free plans that I've provided, link in the video description down below. And while you're down there, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button to subscribe to this channel for future videos. The entire frame of the roof is constructed of 2x2 material, and I designed this to fit the heavy-duty canvas roof that you'll find on a lot of common playsets. I'll also put a link in the video description down below to where you can buy one of those. I put together a little montage of the roof going up, and there's nothing too difficult about this. I started with the box frame on the bottom and worked my way up to the top until I was ready to mount the canvas roof with the supplied hardware. And with the roof complete, I thought it'd be a nice touch to add some solar-powered LED patio lights. 25 feet of these lights does the trick, and I got them off Amazon. I'll provide a link in the video description down below. Basically, all I did was start on the one end, and I started wrapping them around the 4x4 post all the way through under the roof, and I mounted the solar panel on the far right-hand side, where I thought it would see enough sun later in the day. And for the finishing touch, I decided to put together a small cedar planter made from leftover fence boards that I had when I made my fence. Now this thing houses a few artificial IKEA plants, and so they'll always look good and never die. Mounting the planter was pretty straightforward. I used 2 metal L brackets and attached it directly to the railing on the right hand side of the playset. And with all of that complete, it was finally time to sit back, relax, and let the little one enjoy her new playset. And if you guys like this video, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below, and don't forget to check the video description for links to the plans for this playset. Thanks for watching.